Welcome back to another chilling episode of True Crime Untold Cases. Tonight, we're traveling back to 1884 Austin, Texas, years before Jack the Ripper terrorized London's streets. In this frontier town, a shadowy predator stalked the night, targeting society's most vulnerable. 8 victims, mainly young black female servants, would fall to his axe and wooden stakes in a year-long reign of terror. Despite surviving witnesses and bloody crime scenes, this killer, dubbed the servant girl Annihilator, would vanish into history, leaving behind one of America's first documented serial killer cases. Tonight, we unravel the dark mystery that changed Austin forever. Let's begin. In the shadows of late 19th century Austin, Texas, a series of brutal murders would forever change the face of this quiet frontier town. The year was 1884, and as gas lamps flickered in the darkness, a predator stalked the streets, targeting some of society's most vulnerable members. What unfolded over the next year would become one of America's first documented serial killer cases, predating even London's infamous Jack the Ripper. On December 30th, 1884, the first victim was discovered. Molly Smith, a 25-year-old black servant, was found lying in the snow behind her employer's house on West Pecan Street. Her body bore the terrible marks of a savage attack, deep axe wounds, and most disturbingly, a sharp wooden stake driven through her. Walter Spencer, her boyfriend who had been staying with her that night, was also attacked but survived, though his memories of the assault remained frustratingly vague. The police initially dismissed the murder as an isolated incident, perhaps a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. But they couldn't have been more wrong. This was just the beginning of a reign of terror that would grip Austin for the next year, targeting primarily young, black female servants who worked in the homes of wealthy white families. The killer's pattern became clearer with each attack. They would strike in the dead of night, typically entering through unlocked doors or windows. The weapon of choice was almost always an axe, though wooden stakes would become another chilling signature. The brutality of the attacks was shocking. Victims were not just killed, but mutilated, often dragged outside where their bodies would be discovered in the morning light. In May 1885, the terror escalated. Clara Strand and Christine Martinson, 2 young Swedish servants, were attacked while sleeping in their basement quarters. Unlike the previous victims, they were white, but they fit the pattern of being domestic servants. Both survived, though their descriptions of their attacker were contradictory and confused, adding to the growing mystery. The summer of 1885 brought no relief from the horror. Eliza Shelley was found dead on May 6th, her body bearing the now familiar marks of the killer's rage. Less than 2 weeks later, Irene Cross became another victim, her body discovered in a similar state. The city was gripped by fear, and servants began refusing to work in homes without proper locks and security measures. Local newspapers dubbed the killer the servant girl Annihilator, though some called him the midnight assassin. The press coverage was sensational, but also revealed the racial prejudices of the time, while the deaths of black victims received minimal attention. When white servants were attacked, the story made national headlines. The investigation was hampered by the limitations of 19th century forensic science and the racial biases of law enforcement. Multiple suspects were arrested and released, including Walter Spencer and several other black men who had connections to the victims. But evidence was scarce, and witness descriptions varied wildly. Some described the killer as a tall black man, others as a white man in disguise, and still others claimed to have seen a yellow man, possibly of Mexican or Native American descent. One of the most intriguing suspects was a Malaysian cook known as Maurice, who worked at the Pearl House Hotel. He had allegedly threatened to kill women and was known to carry a small axe, but nothing concrete ever tied him to the murders. He eventually left town, and the investigation into his potential involvement went cold. As summer turned to fall, the killer's methods seemed to evolve. On September 28, 1885, Orange, Washington, another black servant, was attacked but survived. His description of the assailant added new details to the growing pile of contradictory evidence. He spoke of a man wearing a white cloth over his face, moving with almost supernatural stealth through the darkness. The terror reached its crescendo on Christmas Eve, 1885. That night, 2 women were killed in separate attacks, Susan Hancock and Eula Phillips. Both were white women from wealthy families, marking a significant departure from the killer's previous victim profile. Susan Hancock was found in her bed, her head crushed with an axe. Eula Phillips was discovered in her backyard, killed in a similarly brutal fashion. The murder of these prominent white women sent shockwaves through Austin society. James Phillips, Eula's husband, was initially arrested for her murder, but was later acquitted. The investigation became increasingly frantic, with police following countless leads that led nowhere. Vigilante groups formed, patrolling the streets at night, but the killer remained elusive. What made these final murders even more perplexing was their deviation from the established pattern. Had the killer grown bolder, or were these copycat killings? Some historians later suggested that these last 2 murders might have been unrelated to the servant girl killings, opportunistic crimes that took advantage of the city's state of fear. The killer's reign of terror had lasted exactly 1 year, claiming 8 lives and leaving several others forever scarred. Then, as mysteriously as they had begun, the murders stopped. Austin slowly began to recover, but the case remained unsolved, leaving a dark chapter in Texas history that would never be fully closed. In the years that followed, numerous theories emerged about the killer's identity. Some suggested it was a gang of men rather than a single perpetrator. Others pointed to various individuals who had left town around the time the murders ceased. One particularly interesting theory suggested that the killer might have moved on to London, where he would become known as Jack the Ripper, though this remains purely speculative. The investigation's failure to identify the servant girl Annihilator left a lasting impact on Austin's law enforcement and social structure. The city's first professional police force was established in direct response to these murders, replacing the previous system of night watchmen and part-time deputies. This modernization of law enforcement would become one of the killer's few positive legacies. The case also exposed the deep racial divisions in post-Reconstruction Texas. While the early victims were primarily black women, their deaths received relatively little attention from law enforcement or the press. It wasn't until white victims were targeted that the full resources of the city were mobilized to catch the killer. This disparity in treatment wasn't lost on Austin's black community, who had long suffered from systemic discrimination and neglect. One of the most compelling aspects of the case was the killer's apparent knowledge of his victims' routines and living situations. This led many to speculate that the murderer might have been someone who worked in or around the homes of wealthy Austinites, perhaps a tradesman, delivery man, or even another servant. The killer's ability to enter homes without forcing entry suggested familiarity with the properties and their occupants. The survivors' accounts, though often contradictory, provided some intriguing details about the attacker's behavior. Several described him as moving with an unusual gait, almost gliding across the floor. Others spoke of his extraordinary strength, noting how he could drag bodies considerable distances. Some witnesses mentioned a peculiar odor associated with the killer, variously described as smoke-like or chemical. One particularly haunting detail came from Clara Strand, one of the Swedish servants who survived. She described waking to see a figure standing in her room, holding what appeared to be a lamp or light source close to his chest. This glowing figure became part of the local folklore, with some suggesting supernatural explanations for the murders. The investigation files reveal several promising leads that were never fully pursued. A bloody handprint was found at one crime scene, unusual for the time period, as fingerprinting was not yet used in criminal investigations. Several witnesses reported seeing a man washing blood from his clothes in Waller Creek in the early morning hours after one of the murders, but this lead was never thoroughly investigated. The case also generated numerous false confessions, a common occurrence in high-profile murders. One man, a drifter named Nathan Elgin, claimed responsibility for the killings shortly before his death in a shootout with police in 1886. However, his confession contained numerous inconsistencies and was ultimately dismissed. Some investigators believed the killer might have had medical knowledge based on the precise nature of some of the wounds. This theory gained traction when it was discovered that several medical students from the newly established University of Texas had been boarding in homes near where the murders occurred. However, like so many other leads, this avenue of investigation ultimately proved fruitless. The use of wooden stakes in the murders particularly puzzled investigators. While the axe was clearly the primary weapon, the stakes seemed to serve a ritualistic purpose. Some experts later suggested this might indicate the killer had some connection to carpentry or woodworking, while others saw it as a signature meant to terrorize the community. The case files also reveal an interesting pattern in the timing of the attacks. Most occurred during or near a full moon, leading some investigators to theorize that the killer needed the moonlight to navigate the dark streets and yards of his victims. This detail would later be cited by those drawing parallels to the Jack the Ripper cases, as several of those murders also occurred during full moons. Perhaps most frustrating for investigators was the killer's apparent ability to vanish without a trace after each murder. Despite leaving bloody crime scenes and sometimes attacking multiple victims in one night, he managed to avoid being seen by anyone who could provide a reliable description. This led to speculation that he might have had access to the network of drainage tunnels beneath Austin, or perhaps maintained a hiding place somewhere in the city. The case had a profound psychological impact on Austin's residents, particularly its servant class. Many domestic workers began traveling in groups and refusing to work in homes without adequate security measures. Some families started housing their servants in the main part of the house rather than in separate quarters, a significant change in the social customs of the time. The murders also changed the way Austinites viewed their city. What had been seen as a relatively safe, growing frontier town was transformed into a place of fear and suspicion. Doors that had previously been left unlocked were now bolted, and women who had once walked freely at night now feared to venture out after dark. This transformation from frontier openness to urban wariness marked a significant shift in Austin's character. The case would go on to influence American criminal investigation techniques. The failure to solve these murders highlighted the need for more sophisticated investigative methods and better coordination between law enforcement agencies. It also demonstrated the importance of preserving crime scenes and collecting physical evidence, concepts that were still in their infancy in the 1880s. The impact of the servant girl Annihilator case extended far beyond its immediate time and place. In the decades that followed, the case became a touchstone for criminologists studying the evolution of serial killer investigations in America. The killer's methodology, targeting vulnerable victims, using extreme violence, and leaving survivors who could provide only confused accounts, would become recognizable patterns in later serial killer cases. One of the most intriguing aspects of the case was its possible connection to other crimes of the era. Some researchers have identified similar attacks in other Texas cities during the same period, suggesting the killer might have been mobile. Reports from Houston, San Antonio, and even as far as Galveston described attacks with similar characteristics: axes, wooden stakes, and victims from vulnerable populations. The case files contain several witness statements that were largely overlooked at the time, but take on new significance when viewed through a modern lens. Multiple witnesses reported seeing a well-dressed man in a long coat walking the streets late at night, often in areas where murders would later occur. While this might seem like a promising lead, in the gaslit streets of 1885 Austin, such sightings were difficult to verify and even harder to connect definitively to the crimes. The killer's choice of weapons has particularly interested modern criminal profilers. The combination of an axe and wooden stakes suggests a perpetrator who may have worked in construction or carpentry, but the specific use of these items might also indicate something about his psychological makeup. The axe, a tool of brutal efficiency, combined with the more ritualistic use of stakes, hints at a killer who merged practical violence with symbolic acts. Weather records from the period reveal another interesting pattern that investigators at the time missed. Many of the attacks occurred on nights with significant cloud cover, suggesting the killer might have deliberately chosen conditions that would make him harder to spot. This level of planning indicates a degree of sophistication that wasn't fully appreciated by 19th century law enforcement. The case also had unexpected effects on Austin's architecture. In the years following the murders, many homes were modified to include better security features. Servant quarters were often relocated closer to the main house, and windows were fitted with stronger locks. Some of these architectural changes can still be seen in historic Austin homes today, silent testimonies to the terror that once gripped the city. Among the more unusual theories that emerged in later years was the suggestion that the killer might have been a woman. This idea, while controversial, was based on several witness accounts that described the attacker as relatively small in stature, and the fact that the killer seemed to move easily through domestic spaces without raising alarm. However, the extreme physical violence involved in the murders made this theory less credible to most investigators. The case files also reveal an interesting detail about Austin's social geography at the time. Many of the attacks occurred within what was known as the servants' quarter corridor, a loosely defined area where many domestic workers lived. This suggests the killer had intimate knowledge of the city's social and racial boundaries, using them to his advantage in selecting victims and escape routes. Modern analysis of the surviving evidence has led some researchers to suggest that the killer might have suffered from a specific type of color blindness, explaining some of the seemingly erratic behavior in victim selection. This theory is based on witness accounts describing the killer's apparent confusion in low-light conditions and his tendency to attack on moonlit nights. The case has also become an important reference point for historians studying the development of American media coverage of crime. The stark difference in how the press covered the murders of black victims versus white victims provides valuable insights into 19th century racial attitudes and journalistic practices. Some of the most compelling evidence comes from the killer's apparent knowledge of domestic routines. He seemed to know when victims would be alone, when houses would be empty, and how to navigate unfamiliar properties in darkness. This suggests he might have been someone who worked in or around these households, perhaps a tradesman, delivery person, or even a former servant. The case files contain several reports of strange incidents in the weeks before each murder: missing items, unexplained noises, and doors found unlocked that had been secured. These details, largely dismissed at the time, suggest the killer might have stalked his victims and possibly even entered their homes before the actual attacks, a behavior that would become recognized as a common pattern among serial killers in later years. The servant girl Annihilator case remains one of America's most puzzling unsolved crimes, a dark mystery that continues to fascinate criminologists and historians. Its influence can be seen in everything from modern police procedures to true crime literature, and its legacy lives on in the collective memory of Austin, a reminder of a time when terror stalked the streets of this Texas city, leaving an indelible mark on its history and development.